Late in the afternoon, I was interrupted by the sharp ring of my landline. The voice on the other end was frantic, reporting a hiker gone missing in a nearby national park. I listened carefully, taking notes as they described what had happened. It was always important to get as much information as possible when beginning a search. It helped us to know which areas needed to be combed over first. The growing concern in my eyes mirrored the fear in their voice on the other end of the line. This was going to be another difficult one. "All right," I said finally, after they had given me all of the details. "I'll start looking for him right away." I hung up and began collecting my things from around my small apartment, a cluttered space filled with maps and charts pinned up on corkboards along every wall. Grabbing my well-worn backpack from beside an armchair covered in dog hair, I quickly loaded it with all of the necessary gear: first aid supplies, a rope, a flare gun, and so on. Despite how late it was getting already, there would still be plenty of light left for searching before nightfall came again at this time of year. And if he'd been out there since yesterday, he could already be running low on food and water. There are many different reasons people go missing while hiking or camping or hunting out here in this part of Canada where I live. But most often, it's just bad luck combined with poor planning that leads them into trouble. They get lost or injured somehow, and then they're unable to find their way back home again without help from someone like me, who knows these woods better than anyone else around here does. And even then, sometimes we're not able to find them until it's too late. But that's why I do what I do, because somebody has to look out for these people who aren't prepared to look out for themselves. And I've got the skills and the knowledge to do it. I got into my vehicle and started the engine, listening to the rattling hum as the old truck came to life. My thoughts were racing as I drove down the highway towards the national park where I'd be starting my search. I ran through everything in my mind, mentally preparing myself for what was about to come. Over a decade of rescues played like a movie reel in my head. Fast-flowing rivers rescues, disoriented hikers found in treacherous trails, children lost, and found again. I thought of all of those past successes and tried not to think about how many times it had gone wrong. But this time would be different. This time I'd find him before he got hurt or worse. This time he wouldn't end up like all those other poor souls who went missing out there in those woods. The sun was already getting low on the horizon when I arrived at the trailhead, where he had last been seen. Late yesterday afternoon by another hiker, who said they passed each other on opposite sides of a small footbridge over a river. That marked one entrance into this vast wilderness area. It wasn't much information to go on, but it was enough for me to start looking from that point forward. The trail was wide and well-trodden, with a mix of mud and dirt underfoot from recent rain. I followed it for a few hundred yards until I came to the location where he had last been seen. There was an abandoned campsite there, a small one-person tent set up in a clearing next to the river. The ground around it was slightly muddy, as if someone had walked through the area recently. I stepped carefully around it, not wanting to disturb any potential evidence that might be lying on the ground nearby. The tent was slightly ajar, as if someone had left in a hurry without closing it up properly behind them. Inside, I found his sleeping bag still rolled up neatly in one corner of the small space. An empty water bottle and flashlight lay on top of his backpack, which had been left inside. There were granola bar wrappers as well, 2 or 3 of them which he hadn't bothered to pack out with him when he'd gone for his hike yesterday morning. This is what we call classic hiker behavior, when people get careless with their garbage and don't take care of their gear properly while they're out here in this wilderness area. It's not something you'd expect from most people who come out here hiking or camping. It happens more often than you might think. I took photos of everything with my camera before stepping back outside into the fresh air again, taking another look around at my surroundings before heading further downriver along the trail towards where he would have gone for his hike yesterday morning. "Where would you go?" I asked myself aloud while looking at my map again and trying to figure out which way made sense for him to have traveled after leaving camp that morning. Wearing a black t-shirt and jeans with hiking boots. That was definitely the same person. "Did you notice anything strange about him?" I asked next. The hiker thought for a moment before answering. "Actually, now that you mention it, yeah, he seemed kinda out of it or something. Like maybe he was on drugs or something." I thanked him for his help and continued downriver along the trail in search of any other signs that might tell me where to go next. An hour later, I found them. Footprints leading off into the woods from a muddy spot beside the river's edge, where they had stopped to drink water or take photographs, perhaps. The tracks were fresh, and there were no others nearby to indicate anyone else had been through here since they had been made. I followed them into the forest, my heart beginning to race as I realized how easy it would be for someone to get lost out here if they didn't know their way around already. The sun was getting low in the sky by this point, so we didn't have much time left before darkness fell again across these woods like a curtain being drawn shut at nightfall. But we would find him soon enough, hopefully before anything bad happened to him. After another 15 minutes of walking through dense underbrush and over fallen trees, we came upon another small clearing with an arrangement of rocks sitting in its center, which caught my attention immediately. There were 5 stones placed in an odd, almost T-shaped pattern which looked deliberate somehow, as if someone had placed them there using some kind of method or reasoning known only to themselves. I unfolded a map from my pocket, my eyes quickly tracing over marked trails and topographical lines. Plotting out the possible routes he might have taken, I tried to predict a path from the disheveled campsite. The hiker had left his gear behind, something no experienced outdoorsman would ever do, so I knew he was probably still alive and nearby. The question was, where? I took photos of everything with my camera before stepping back outside into the fresh air again, taking another look around at my surroundings before heading further downriver along the trail towards where he would have gone for his hike yesterday morning. While looking at my map again and trying to figure out which way made sense for him to have traveled after leaving camp that morning. It wasn't long before I saw another hiker coming towards me along the trail from upstream. He stopped when we met each other face to face, and I asked him if he'd seen a young man matching the description of the one who was missing. "Yeah, I saw him yesterday," he said, looking confused. "He walked past me on this trail right around noon." I asked him what he could remember about the guy, and he described his appearance: tall, thin, wearing a black t-shirt and jeans with hiking boots. That was definitely our guy. "Did you notice anything strange about him?" I asked next. The hiker thought for a moment before answering. "Actually, now that you mention it, yeah, he seemed kinda out of it or something. Like maybe he was on drugs or something." I thanked him for his help and continued downriver along the trail in search of any other signs that might tell me where to go next. An hour later, I found them. Footprints leading off into the woods from a muddy spot beside the river's edge, where they had stopped to drink water, or take photographs perhaps. The tracks were fresh, and there were no others nearby to indicate anyone else had been through here since they had been made. I followed them into the forest, my heart beginning to race as I realized how easy it would be for someone to get lost out here if they didn't know their way around already. The sun was getting low in the sky by this point, so we didn't have much time left before darkness fell again across these woods, like a curtain being drawn shut at nightfall. But we would find him soon enough, hopefully before anything bad happened to him. After another 15 minutes of walking through dense underbrush and over fallen trees, we came upon another small clearing with an arrangement of rocks sitting in its center, which caught my attention immediately. There were 5 stones placed in an odd, almost T-shaped pattern, which looked deliberate somehow. The air was heavy and cold, the smell of damp earth and rotting leaves filling my nostrils as I looked around at the clearing. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing up, and I felt a shiver run down my spine, as if someone had walked over my grave. This place felt wrong somehow, like there was something evil in the air. But despite that feeling, I continued to search for more clues to tell me where he had gone after leaving his campsite behind. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. But there was no one else around for miles, just me and this empty forest with its tall trees, which seemed to loom overhead like silent sentinels watching over us from above. But they weren't just watching us, they were waiting too. For what? I couldn't say, but it made me nervous all the same. A gust of wind blew through the trees and a chill ran down my spine again as goosebumps broke out across my skin. The temperature had dropped 10 degrees in an instant, it seemed. My heart rate began to climb again after having slowed during our search of his campsite area. My mind raced with thoughts about what could be happening out here in these woods, so far away from anyone who could help him if he got into trouble. "Where are you?" I muttered aloud while looking around at my surroundings once more, trying desperately to find some kind of clue that would point us in his direction. As night fell, cool darkness wrapping itself around the park, I turned on my flashlight. In the deafening silence of wilderness, I heard something. Whispers, soft, unintelligible, from no identifiable source. I spun around, scanning the darkness, but saw nothing. "Hello?" A gust of wind blew through the trees and a chill ran down my spine again as goosebumps broke out across my skin. The temperature had dropped 10 degrees in an instant, it seemed. My heart rate began to climb again after having slowed during our search of his campsite area. My mind raced with thoughts about what could be happening out here in these woods, so far away from anyone who could help him if he got into trouble. "Where are you?" I muttered aloud while looking around at my surroundings once more, trying desperately to find some kind of clue that would point us in his direction. The sound came again. Another soft, whispering noise coming from behind me this time. It was like someone was speaking just barely above a whisper, and they were too far away for me to make out any words or sounds they might have been making. But it didn't sound like English or any other language I was familiar with. It sounded ancient somehow, primal and guttural like an animal's growl. I shuddered involuntarily as another cold breeze blew through the trees, and for a moment it almost sounded like laughter on the wind. No way. That couldn't be right, though, could it? There's no such thing as ghosts or monsters or any of that crap people talk about when telling stories around campfires late at night. And yet there was something undeniably eerie about this place that made me feel uneasy. Ignoring those feelings for now, though, choosing instead to focus on finding this missing hiker before anything bad happened to him, I continued walking deeper into the woods. The sound came again, louder this time, like a voice right next to my ear, whispering into it, "Look." I spun around, scanning the area around me for any sign of movement or life. There was nothing there, though, just the same trees and underbrush as before. The sound came again, and I realized it wasn't coming from outside my head at all. It was coming from inside my own mind. "Look!" My flashlight beam illuminated something up ahead in the distance, a small figure standing beneath a tree watching me with glowing red eyes. It looked like a child, but I couldn't be sure until I got closer. As I walked towards it, the figure began to move backward away from me, disappearing into the forest as if it had never been there at all. I walked for hours, calling out to the missing hiker, but there was no response. I realized I was getting too far away from my truck and decided to turn back. The blanket of night brought with it a heightened sense of wariness about what truly lay hidden within the national park. I had no choice but to set up a temporary camp and spend the night searching for him again in the morning. After making a small fire and eating some food, I laid down in my sleeping bag inside my tent. The woods were silent around me, too silent. It was almost as if they were holding their breath, waiting for something. The light of my flashlight illuminated the walls of my tent as I shone it around outside to make sure nothing was lurking out there in the darkness, but all I saw were trees and underbrush. Sleep came for me. It took a while, though, longer than usual, because I couldn't shake this feeling that I was being watched by something out here, something that didn't want me here anymore. But eventually, after a while of being on edge like that, you start to get tired enough that you feel like you could sleep through anything, even an earthquake or an explosion right next door. As the first light of dawn began to crawl over the earth, I ate a quick breakfast and then packed up my campsite. It had been a long night, and I was tired, but there was no time for rest. Continuing my search, I stumbled upon a series of old photographs near the bank of a bubbling creek. They seemed oddly placed, covered thinly by sand and shrubbery, as if someone had tried to bury them but had given up halfway through. The images on these photos were faded with time, barely showing people that I didn't recognize. Men and women in old-fashioned clothes from what looked like sometime in the 1800s or early 1900s. The pictures were all black and white, so it was hard to tell much about them, other than that they seemed very old. And yet, There was an inexplicable sensation running through my mind as I looked at these images, a sort of recognition that made no sense at all. A strange sense of déjà vu prickled at the back of my neck like spiders crawling up my... I pushed it aside as best as I could and moved on with my search. I decided to follow the direction of the creek, hoping that it would lead me to more clues. The water was moving slowly here, and there were a number of rocks jutting out from the surface. I stepped carefully from one to another, crossing over and continuing on with my search. After another hour or so, I found something else, a small pile of what looked like animal bones in a clearing by the water's edge. There was no flesh left on them, and it seemed as if they had been picked clean by scavengers long ago. But that wasn't all I found there. There were also some old clothes sitting atop those bones, an old hat that looked like it belonged in a museum, and an old pair of boots that were crumbling apart with age. And beneath them was something even more interesting, a small piece of paper that was yellowed with age but still legible. It read, "I can hear you calling me." The words sent shivers down my spine as I read them aloud to myself. They seemed so cryptic and strange. What did they mean? Who had written this? The hairs on my arms stood up, but it didn't make sense for any human being to be out here in these woods wearing clothes like these. And yet, the photos from earlier had shown people wearing similar outfits. I shook off the sensation again and moved forward through the forest once more. I continued my search, moving through the trees along the creek, scanning the ground for any sign of the missing hiker. It was strange how there were so few clues. Usually in cases like this, you could find something to help you narrow down your search, a broken branch, or a footprint in soft dirt, but there was nothing here. As I traversed the field bordering the creek, I saw something flickering in my peripheral vision. It was like a shadow moving among shadows, a distant figure standing beneath one of the tall trees at the edge of that field. My heart leaped as I saw it, but then it disappeared again as if it had never been there at all. A mirage, a trick of my eyes and mind playing tricks on me after being awake for so long with no sleep. I blinked and rubbed at my eyes with one hand, trying to shake off what I'd seen or not seen. It had been like an illusion, an apparition that felt real somehow, despite its ghostly nature. Shaking off that feeling yet again, as best as I could manage, I moved forward through those woods once more, and still no sign of him. The sense of urgency began to grow within me again, and I pushed myself harder than ever before. The sun was high overhead now, and beginning its descent towards evening once more, by the time I found what looked like another clue, an old backpack sitting atop some rocks by that creek bed. But when I opened it up, there were only some old clothes inside, moth-eaten shirts and pants from decades ago which were falling apart when touched. There was also something else inside, though. A small piece of paper with writing on it. "Can you hear me?" The words sent shivers down my spine yet again, but still they didn't make sense to me. What did they mean? Who had written this? The words were rattling around in my brain as I moved through those trees, my eyes scanning the ground for any sign of the missing hiker. It was strange how there were so few clues. Usually in cases like this, you could find something to help you narrow down your search, a broken branch, or a footprint in soft dirt. But there was nothing here. As I traversed the field bordering the creek, I saw something move in my peripheral vision. It was like a shadow moving among shadows, a distant figure standing beneath one of the tall trees at the edge of that field. My heart leaped as I saw it, but then it disappeared again, as if it had never been there at all. A mirage, a trick of my eyes and mind playing tricks on me after being awake for so long with no sleep. I blinked and rubbed at my eyes with one hand, trying to shake off what I'd seen, or not seen. It had been like an illusion, an apparition that felt real somehow despite its ghostly nature. Shaking off that feeling yet again as best as I could manage, I moved forward through those woods once more. The eerie silence of the forest was broken by a sound that made me stop in my tracks. It was the voice of a man calling out to me from somewhere nearby. "Can you hear me?" it said, repeating those same words over and over again, and then it changed its tune, speaking with my own voice. "Can you hear me? Can you hear?" It said it again and again, each time sounding more like my voice than the last. But there was something wrong about it, something off. I called back to him once more, but he didn't respond this time. The sound of his voice had been distant, and I wasn't sure if I'd really heard him or not. Maybe he had been calling for help just now. Or maybe that had been someone else entirely. Your brain plays tricks on you all the time, especially when you're sleep-deprived and exhausted like I was right now, after hours spent searching through these woods in vain with no sign of this missing hiker anywhere at all. But that other sound hadn't come from my brain. I knew that much at least. The environment around me vibrated with an energy, as if I was standing inside a giant bell that had just been struck with a hammer. The air quivered around me as the chilling call reverberated through it once more, distorting into an inhuman cry that didn't sound anything like human speech anymore. "Can you hear me?" The words sent shivers down my spine yet again, but still. They didn't make sense to me. What did they mean? Who had said this? I called again, my voice shaking with fear and confusion. "Hello? Is someone there?" There was no response at first, and I began to wonder if I'd imagined the sound. But then it came again. It sounded like a man's voice this time, or at least something that resembled one. "Can you hear me?" The voice said again, repeating those same words over and over again, as if on an endless loop. It was coming from somewhere nearby, but I couldn't tell where exactly. The trees all around were so thick with foliage that it made everything look like shadows in the dim light of dusk as we approached nightfall. "Hello!" I called out once more, louder now. And then there was another sound, much closer than before, like someone whispering in my ear directly beside me. "Can you hear me?" The words were right next to my face now, and they weren't speaking them anymore, just repeating them over and over again, like a broken record skipping on its track. I turned around quickly, but there was no one behind us except for the empty forest stretching away into darkness as far as the eye could see. We were alone. As soon as we heard that eerie call once more, we both jumped back involuntarily, our eyes widening in terror as we looked all around us for any sign of who or what might be making these sounds. But there was nothing here except for trees and darkness and silence. What is going on here? My voice trailed off into nothingness after saying those words aloud, because I realized that there was no answer to that question. There was no explanation for this, not a rational one at least. The voice came again, and it sounded like it was coming from every direction all at once, surrounding us on all sides. It sounded like a chorus of people speaking in unison, and then the words changed again, becoming more distorted with each repetition. "Can you hear me? Can you hear me?" It said those same words again and again, as if by repeating them enough times we might understand what they meant, but I had no idea. The words were rattling around in my brain as I moved through those trees, my eyes scanning the ground for any sign of the missing hiker. I moved through those trees, my eyes searching the ground for any sign of the missing hiker. The sound of that voice was still ringing in my ears, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. What could it be? What did it want from us? The forest was so quiet now, as if all the birds and insects had gone silent with fear. And then I saw something ahead, a wooden structure in the overgrown plant life. It looked like an old cabin or hunting shack at first, but as I got closer, I saw that it wasn't just abandoned. It was falling apart. The exterior of the building had been grayed with age and weather, its wooden beams rotting and crumbling away in places. There were holes in the roof where rainwater must have poured in during storms, turning this place into a damp and moldy ruin. I approached cautiously, looking around to see if anyone else was here besides me, but there didn't seem to be anyone nearby. Inside there were signs that someone had recently been seeking refuge here, though. A sleeping bag lay on top of an old mattress covered in mouse droppings. A small fire pit had been cleared out near one wall where someone might have made camp during their stay. But there were no belongings left behind, which seemed strange to me, especially considering how dangerous these woods could be at night. The hairs on my arms stood up on end as we entered further into the space past a row of rotting kitchen cabinets covered with rat droppings. And then we heard another sound coming from outside again, a long, mournful cry echoing through the woods like an animal in pain. "Can you hear me?" the voice said again, sounding more distorted than ever. I tried not to let it get to me as we looked around the cabin for any sign of where he might have gone next, but it was hard not to feel a sense of unease in this place. It was like a tomb, cold and lifeless, and full of secrets. I moved into one of the back rooms, feeling my way along the wall with my hand until I found a doorframe leading into another space. The air here smelled even worse than before, like something had died in this room. And then I saw what it was. A dead rat lay on its back near my feet, flies buzzing around its bloated body as if they were waiting for something. For some reason, that sight made me think about what happened last night, when I'd woken up from that dream. The image of those eyes staring at me from outside my tent. And then another sound came again from outside, making every hair on my body stand up straight once more, as if charged with electricity. "Can you hear me?" It sounded like it was coming from right outside this room now, and I peered through the broken window pane to see if anyone was out there. But there wasn't anything except trees stretching away into darkness as far as the eye could see. The voice continued speaking those same words over and over again, growing louder each time until they were deafeningly loud inside my head. "Can you hear me?" My heart felt like it would explode inside my chest at any moment now. My head pounded with each beat, so loud that I couldn't even think straight anymore. All rational thought had been replaced by sheer terror, which surged through every vein in my body now, making everything look red and hazy around the edges. And then there was another sound, a low, rumbling noise like thunder. The ground beneath my feet began to shake and I fell to my knees, grabbing onto a table leg for support as I tried not to fall over. The voice stopped speaking at once. The silence that followed was almost deafening in comparison. And then it came again, that same sound from outside. A long, mournful cry echoing through the woods like an animal in pain. "Can you hear me?" I looked around, but there didn't seem to be anyone else here with us except for those rats and flies. There were no signs of life anywhere nearby except for this cabin, which had been abandoned long ago by the looks of it. I made the decision to stay in the cabin for the night as the sunlight began to fade. I tried not to think about it too much, and then I thought about it some more. The feeling of being watched was even stronger now, and I wondered if I'd made a mistake by coming here. Loneliness and nightfall were two ideas that went hand in hand with fear in my mind. The idea of being alone at night in a place like this, an abandoned cabin, was enough to make anyone's imagination run wild. But I didn't have any other options. If he wasn't here, then where else could he have gone? There weren't many places left for me to look, and so I stayed there that night, despite everything screaming at me from inside my mind, telling me not to do it. The quest for answers outweighed my fear eventually, as is often the case when you're searching for someone who's missing. Eventually the sun went down and darkness swallowed up everything outside, except for what little light could penetrate through those broken windows high above my head. I wasn't expecting to find anything else in the cabin, but I was wrong. Alone in the small room, I stumbled upon an old journal that had been left behind. Its pages were worn thin, covered with hastily scribbled messages. It didn't seem to belong to the hiker. His name wasn't written on it anywhere. And I began flipping through some of the entries. The dates were from a couple years ago, and they seemed to be from someone who had been staying at this very same cabin. As I read through them, one recurring note became apparent. The anonymous writer repeatedly claimed to feel observed when trekking these woods nearby. The fear in their notes came across clearly in their erratic handwriting. They wrote about feeling like they were being watched constantly while out there, as if something was stalking them through those trees. The feeling of unease that had come over me earlier returned all at once and amplified tenfold as I flipped through more entries. After a handful of nerve-wracking hours, the feeling of being watched had intensified, and I couldn't shake the thought that someone or something was lurking just outside. The journal weighed heavy in my hands, the scrawled messages inside haunting me with their tone. It wasn't letting me remain at peace, even as I tried to tell myself it was all just a prank or some kind of sick joke. But deep down I knew better than that. I made up my mind then and there. As soon as the sun was up, I would pack my things and leave this place. The next morning, when I stepped out of the age-old cabin, I was struck with an overwhelming sensation of being pursued. My heart raced in my chest as I looked around at the empty forest surrounding me. There was no one there to see, just trees and rocks and dirt. But it felt like something, or someone, was watching me. Fear and adrenaline fueled my feet as I began walking back toward the trailhead. The feeling intensified with every step, as if there were an invisible presence trailing me in the shadows. It reminded me of that old journal I'd found inside. Those unseen eyes mentioned within it seemed to be locked onto me now, driving me into a state of paranoia. I tried to shake off the feeling, but couldn't. The weight of those pages still haunted me, even after leaving them behind in that cabin. My imagination was running wild now, showing me glimpses of a man hiding behind trees or crouching down low on all fours like some kind of animal stalking its prey. My footsteps became faster until they were almost at a jog, and then finally, full-on sprinting as I made my way through the woods. Guided by instinct and a lifetime of survival experiences, I tried to shake my invisible pursuer off my trail. Jogging through an underbrush, my feet crunching on dried leaves with each step, I felt like there was someone right behind me, just out of sight. But every time I looked back, there was no one there. I zigzagged my way through trees and overgrown ferns as much as possible, cleverly obscuring my footprints so that whoever was following me would have a hard time keeping up with where I'd gone. It wouldn't be impossible for them to find their way after me if they were skilled at tracking, but it would make their pursuit more tangled than if I'd just walked in a straight line. The feeling never left, though. It only intensified as the minutes ticked by and turned into hours. Whoever or whatever was following me refused to give up their pursuit. It reminded me again of that old journal from the cabin. Those unseen eyes mentioned within it seemed to be locked onto me now, driving me into this state of paranoia. I knew better than anyone how dangerous these woods could be when you didn't know what you were doing out here. And whoever this person or thing was had been watching me closely for days now. It felt like I was being watched the entire time, my skin crawling as if there were eyes upon me. But when I finally found a clearing, the feeling lessened somewhat. The area was eerily calm, an almost electrical tension hanging heavy in the air. And there were more of those stone structures, similar to the ones I'd seen at the previous campsite. They were arranged in a peculiar fashion, some of them stacked on top of each other, and others placed haphazardly, as if they had been abandoned mid-construction. I shook my head and tried to ignore them, moving through the clearing and heading towards another trail that led further into the woods. The whole place gave me chills down my spine, and I wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible. But then something caught my eye from behind one of those stone structures, a flash of color amongst all that gray rock. It was red fabric, and it looked oddly familiar. I approached slowly, knowing what it would be before I even got close enough to see it clearly with my own eyes. A backpack sat propped up against one of those stones. It was torn open at one end and empty inside, except for a few granola bar wrappers, which had been chewed up by rodents or insects looking for food. This bag belonged to Jack Thompson, missing hiker number 2 from this year alone. My heart raced in my chest now, beating like a jackhammer inside me. My mind went back to all those messages scrawled inside that old cabin's walls again. The ones telling me not to look for him, telling me he didn't want to be found. No matter how many times I told myself it was just some kind of sick prank or joke someone had played on me, deep down inside, I knew better than that. The feeling of being watched returned, and it was stronger than ever. It felt like there were eyes on me from every direction, unseen presences hiding behind the trees and rocks, watching my every move. I turned around to look back at the stone structures in the clearing, and I saw them now for what they truly were, the same thing I'd seen at the previous campsite. And now I knew what they meant. They were headstones. This place was a graveyard, and whoever had made these arrangements with such precision had done so for a reason. To keep him here, to keep him from being found. But why? Was he alive out here somewhere? Was that even possible? I looked down at the stones, and then back at the backpack. A theory was beginning to form in my mind now, as I saw more and more of these stone arrangements. They were everywhere out here, and they were all made with such precision, like a message or an explanation hidden within them. I shook my head, trying to clear those thoughts away for now. There would be time for that later, when I wasn't so far from civilization and so close to whatever it was out here that wanted me gone from this place. The feeling of being watched returned again as soon as I'd had that thought. But this time, it was different. It wasn't just eyes on me anymore. It felt like there were dozens of people surrounding me in those woods. And something else. Shining my flashlight into the darkness between two trees where the sound had come from. But there was nothing there. Suddenly, from within the clearing, I saw a figure materialize. It was as if it had been there all along and I just hadn't noticed it. But now that my eyes were on it, I couldn't look away. The figure stood there in the middle of the stone headstones like a ghost. Except that's exactly what it was. The thing was glowing with an otherworldly light, casting eerie shadows all around us. It looked like a person at first, but then again, not quite. Its form flickered and changed as if seen through a mist or fog. At times it appeared almost human, but its features were blurred and indistinct, impossible to make out clearly. Its movements were fluid and graceful in an unnatural way, like watching water flowing uphill. I felt my heart rate increase rapidly now, as fear took hold of me once again. This thing wasn't human. It was something else entirely. "Who are you?" I asked shakily, trying to sound brave despite my terror. "You already know who I am," the entity replied cryptically. "What do you want?" I demanded angrily now, feeling frustration welling up inside me at its cryptic responses. "You have come here seeking answers," the figure said simply. "You have come seeking truth. I came here looking for a missing hiker," I shouted angrily at it now. "And find him you will," the figure said simply in response to my outburst of anger and frustration with him. "What? What does that mean? Follow your instincts. They will lead you where you need to go." And with that final sentence hanging in the air between us, whatever this entity was, it was gone. Disappeared like a ghost into the night. I stood there for a long time, feeling a chill run down my spine as I looked at the stone headstones again. And then I started to move. I ran from the clearing, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back as I sprinted through the trees, using every bit of energy I had left in me to get away from that place. When I finally did look back over my shoulder, there was nobody there. The figure had disappeared again, as quickly and mysteriously as it had initially appeared. I stood there for a long time, panting and trying to catch my breath. The forest was silent around me now, no longer filled with the sound of whispering voices or creaking branches. It felt like a normal place again, like just another park in Canada. But then I looked down at the stones once more and saw them everywhere around me again, all those strange arrangements of rocks which seemed to be forming pathways through the woods. Whatever that thing was, it had been right about one thing at least. I needed to follow my instincts if I wanted to find that missing hiker, and so far they were telling me one thing very clearly: go deeper into these woods. After about half an hour longer of running through the forest, I stumbled upon him. He was alive, thank God, but he was trembling and mumbling to himself physically, as if he were freezing cold or in shock, or both. "It's okay, buddy. You're safe now." He didn't respond at first, just kept on shivering and mumbling to himself. "Shadows," he muttered in a trembling voice that sounded far away somehow. Whispers. "So many shadows." "What happened?" I asked urgently, my heart rate spiking up with anxiety despite my best efforts to keep calm for his sake. Couldn't find the trail. He was talking slowly, as if it were difficult for him to form words properly. Got turned around. Then the shadows came. So many of them. I shook my head in confusion as he continued on like this for a few more minutes, just repeating the same things over and over again about shadows and whispers. My blood ran cold at the thought of what Jordan had been experiencing while lost out here alone in these woods without food or water for hours on end. But I was going to get him back home safely now, that much I knew for certain. With adrenaline powering my movements, I helped Jordan to his feet and got him moving. His legs were weak and he was stumbling over roots and rocks every few steps, but I kept him going. We had to get out of this place before it was too late. The feeling of unease grew stronger with every step we took. The woods felt denser than they had before, more dark and sinister somehow, and the sounds coming from within seemed to be getting louder as well. But now that I thought about it, they didn't sound like birds or squirrels anymore. I turned my head back and forth, looking around at the eerie woodland persistently as we moved through it. My heart rate increased with anxiety, as a chill ran down my spine with every rustle of leaves behind us. What was happening? Where were these noises coming from? We continued on for another minute or two, until finally we broke through into a clearing where sunlight streamed down through the trees above us once again. The hiker collapsed onto his knees as soon as he stepped out into the open air, gasping for breaths of fresh oxygen, after being deprived of them in those dark woods for so long. I knelt down beside him, offering him some water from my canteen, which he drank greedily until it was half empty. "Thanks," he said after taking a moment to catch his breath again. I don't know what happened back there. It felt like something was pushing me away, like something didn't want me leaving those woods. "It's okay now," I told him reassuringly, even though I wasn't sure if that was true or not myself. "You're safe." But even as I said this, there was still an uneasy feeling in my gut that wouldn't go away no matter how much logic told me everything would be fine now that we were outside those dark woods again. My eyes kept darting around the clearing, scanning for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. And as I looked out into the forest again, it seemed darker and more menacing than ever. I got to my feet and helped Jordan up again. Then we began making our way to a nearby ranger station. The whole time my eyes were locked on those dark woods, waiting for something to emerge from within them. After about a 5-mile hike, we both finally reached the park ranger station safely. The whole time I was fighting the urge to look back over my shoulder at those dark woods, but I didn't want to seem paranoid or scared in front of Jordan, so I just kept my eyes focused on the path ahead of us and kept moving forward. When we got there, I rushed inside and began telling the first ranger I could find what had happened. My voice trembled slightly as I spoke, but for the most part it was steady and calm, just like it always is when you're in this line of work. I've been doing this job for long enough now that nothing really surprises me anymore, not even something like this. But still, it's better if people don't know about these things. It's better if they just continue living their lives thinking everything is normal and safe out there in those woods. Stepping out of the station, I felt a wave of relief wash over me, diluting some of the tension that had held my body stiff. It was good to be away from that place, even if it was just for a few minutes. The darkness and coldness inside seemed to have seeped into my bones, and it took a moment for me to shake off the feeling. However, this relief was pierced by a spike of unanswered questions, which came rushing back in like water through an open floodgate. I shook my head, trying to clear away these thoughts as I always did after coming back from one of these cases. There would be no answers for me today, at least not any satisfying ones. After all, what could possibly make sense about something like this? I got back home and tried to go about my daily routine as if nothing had happened. But the thoughts of what I experienced in those woods played on an endless loop in my mind, and the hiker's shaky words about shadows and whispers wouldn't stop echoing in my head either. "Something was chasing me," he'd said. "There was something out there with me. I could feel it. It was watching me." And then there were those dark woods again, always at the edge of my vision whenever I closed my eyes. I shook these thoughts away as best as I could and tried to get back into the groove of day-to-day life. But no matter what I did, they just wouldn't leave me alone. One night, I was lying in bed, trying to get some sleep after another long day. My mind was still racing with thoughts about the case, and I couldn't seem to get it out of my head, no matter how hard I tried. Suddenly, a soft whisper came from outside my window. It sounded like it was right next to me, the voice so close that I could feel its breath on my neck. But when I looked around, there was nobody there, just an empty room and a moonlit forest outside. My heart skipped a beat and I jolted upright in bed, looking around frantically for whoever had spoken those words. But there was nobody inside the room with me. Just that same empty air which seemed colder than before. The voice whispered again from outside the window, louder this time, "Come back." It bore an uncanny resemblance to that sound I heard in the woods. I leapt out of bed and ran to the window, throwing open the blinds and peering out into the pitch-black night. But there was nobody there. I closed my eyes for a moment and took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down. It had just been my imagination playing tricks on me. That was all. I'd been thinking about this case too much lately and it had bled over into my dreams. That's all. There was nothing else going on here. I pulled the curtains shut and tried to get back into bed, but the feeling of being watched was still there. It was as if someone or something was standing just on the other side of those thin pieces of fabric, staring in at me. I closed my eyes and tried to tell myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me again. But deep down inside, I knew that wasn't true. And no matter how hard I tried, that coldness wouldn't leave me alone.